Thanks so much, Don. We're really pleased you came to this meeting. After doing an event for us 2 weeks ago. Great to have you here for a follow-up. I do want to say, despite whatever glitches or frustrations or 500 emails we went through for the first Nancy MacLean event, it was totally worth it, and I thought very successful. I definitely think we reached a lot of people. We had 270 people on the Zoom. We had a follow-up meeting last week with 50 people, and they're motivated. A lot of people got the book, read it, and are saying, what can we do? So our meeting today is about Don's revelations, reading the book, and his recommendations for things we can do. What I want to say, as MacLean said in the forum, doing this work really is a lot of fun. And you do walk with the best people in doing it. And certainly, Don, you're one of the best people. We're honored to be able to walk with you. And we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Terry. Thank you very much. That feels heartfelt, and I take it as that, and it is a joy for me to be able to continue my work. I retired about 11 years ago, but I'm working harder today and doing more things today than I did when I was working 12 hours a day, because that was 5 days a week. I'm working 7 days a week now, with as many hours devoted to 12 boards, all nonprofit boards around issues of climate change and the environment and food security. And I do a podcast for Geoversity of Earth Intelligence. It can be found at earthintel.org. And we've managed to get some incredible people. In fact, Nancy is going to probably be up on Friday. So we've established a great working relationship. And she's in Chicago now. North Carolinians move north during the summer. Floridians move to North Carolina, and North Carolinians move to New York or someplace else. And I had to tell her that it was 102 degrees up here, and she wasn't escaping anything. We've had a great relationship develop, and I'm very fond of her, and I'm fond of the work that she does from a journalist perspective. I know she's an academic, but her work was revelatory and investigative in nature. And so I associated very deeply with her discoveries and what she uncovered. And the book was a revelation. But I want to hasten to add, on behalf of Nancy and on behalf of those people who have been critical of the book, outside of the trolls and the bots, which she has been beset with criticism from libertarian groups, conservative groups, and what have you, even some people in academia associated with the Hoover Institute and what have you, who want to say that her book is a fabrication, which it is not. She is able to support every claim that she makes. But I wanted to say on her behalf that it is not the history of the conservative movement that we see today visibly before us, which primarily is made up of people who are associated with Donald Trump, who still consider themselves Trumpians as opposed to supporters of Donald Trump, but supporters of the idea of Donald Trump. And those people who are in Congress who are being obstructionists toward any kind of move that would be salutary when it comes to climate change. Those are the visible parts. And what she wanted to be able to tell us in the book was that there is that stealth movement, which is in the title, that intentionally the work being done is being done with glacial speed. They're not in a hurry. They know that if they can accomplish what they want to accomplish, then they can do it before our very eyes without us paying any attention to it. And so that was one of the best warnings that is in the book, that all of this is happening before our very eyes. We simply don't see the hour hand move. But if I stop you and say, look at how the Supreme Court has been packed into a conservative majority, that is a stealth move, and it is the Federalist Society, and it is the Heritage Society. It is Koch-funded people behind that move, and it is changing our democracy. The creative point that I think brings us some coalescence and understanding what is happening is all of us are focused not only on the environment and climate change, but not even secondarily, but paired equally with that is the not only environmental justice, but the environmental racial justice and the problems of minority rights and systemic racism in this country. So we're primed to listen to what can be considered the voice of the minority, that she positions people like Koch all the way from John C. Calhoun forward, as you heard in the discussion, through Harry Byrd and through the 54 Brown versus Board of Education and public choice economics, is positioning themselves in the public mind, these rich people, these rich conservative libertarian people, are positioning themselves as a minority and therefore should be protected as a minority, so that if a flourishing democracy where everyone has a vote, they're concerned that if democracy continues on its path of expansion of rights of individuals to vote, that they will be overwhelmed as the minority. So they are trying to get some sympathy. And in fact, Buchanan won the Nobel Prize in economics for that very concept, that a democracy can turn into something other than what we recognize as a democracy when a minority of people are set upon. That's their argument. That is the Koch argument. That is the argument of the 1/10 of 1% who control 90% of the wealth in the United States. And so this is not anything new to me, because in 55 years, and then if you count my reading of history, 200, 300 years, specifically looking at the golden age, the gilded age, as they called it in the 1890s to the 1910s, the very same thing happened with J.P. Morgan, the Vanderbilts, and the railroads, and the James J. Hills. They controlled not only the wealth, but they controlled through means of purchasing the favors of elected officials to pass laws that were favorable to the economic welfare, well-being of these giant organizations. So Koch and others have taken a page out of that. But if you look at our tax code that exists today, much of that was written by the people who didn't want to pay taxes. And that was done not because there was any real benefit to that, except these people were putting money in the coffers of elected officials and their treasure chests and their war chests, so that they could get laws passed under our very noses, including tax cuts, but also the thousands and thousands of loopholes that exist. That's all done in Washington. We don't see it. Sometimes the laws are very small. Sometimes it's just a word change in a document. But that is the process, the stealth process of changing the democracy from being in the hands of voters. And public choice is meaningful to me because I cut my teeth on the effects of the Brown versus Board of Education and the civil rights movement of the 60s. Nobody knows this except I'm going to tell you. When I was 15 years old, I mowed lawns to make money, and we didn't make much money. The older folks can tell you that we didn't make much money mowing lawns. I would mow a 2-acre lawn and make $1.25. But I saved $5, and with that $5, I sent it to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference when I was 15, and became a card-carrying member. They sent me a membership card to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Martin Luther King Jr.'s organization, because I wanted to be a part of that fight. Just as a personal aside, being a white kid who had little fight and little fire in his belly, had nothing to fight for. And so I chose to fight for others. And it puts me in mind of Bob Dylan's song that Shirley Caesar later re-recorded as a gospel tune called "You Got to Serve Somebody." And it is my internalize that, and I believe it in my heart that it's my responsibility to serve somebody. And so journalism became my service, and lifting up the voices of others. And then it turned into climate change as I did it as an investigative report, because at the time that I started this, there was a debate. There is no debate, of course, but a manufactured debate that this expert says, yes, there's climate change, and this expert says, no, there isn't climate change, it's a hoax. And journalism made a major error early on under the almost a forgivable error, that they believed that balance was one of the underpinnings of good journalism. And so if you didn't know, if a journalist didn't know what the truth was, you asked this person on this side and asked this person on this side, and then left it to the public to kind of figure out which one was right. But as an investigative reporter, the onus on me was completely different. It wasn't just providing two sides of a story. My job was to find out which side was telling the truth. And so that first investigation into climate change, 30 years after we'd been warned, actually 150 years after Tyndall and Arrhenius had done the original research that showed that CO2 was causing this problem. But I'm getting off track. I'm not talking about climate change, but climate change is an important issue when it comes to the effect of the Koch brothers. So what Nancy did in her book was not try to explain the conservative movement, which was one of the criticisms of the academics about her book, is that they took it to mean that she was trying to draw a line from John C. Calhoun to the way Congress acts today, that they're operating on the same principle. That wasn't the inclination. She was saying where public choice ideals came from. But there is a lot of making going on in the creation of the conservative movement in America. And I will freely admit that I am the product of a Republican household. My mother and father were very strict Republicans, but I hasten to add that they were Abraham Lincoln, Teddy Roosevelt Republicans, and they were environmentalists to the degree they could be an environmentalist before environmentalism was a thing. But my dad was the president of the Conservation Club. My mother was the secretary of the Conservation Club. They were outdoors people. They loved nature. They wanted to protect nature. In the meantime, the White River that ran through my city ran red because of all of the steel filings that were being dumped well before the Clean Water Act passed, under, by the way, Richard Nixon, which while I give him absolutely no credit as president of the United States, I do give him some credit for establishing the Environmental Protection Agency and for his work on the Clean Water and Clean Air Act, although he was only responsible for one of those two. So one of the things that is missing in Nancy's telling, if you were to judge it as the doctrine of conservatism through a heavy reliance on libertarian thinking, which is basically small government and get out of my life government and leave me alone and stop regulation and stop trying to provide medicine and stop trying to give us Social Security. That's not the role of government. Stop spending our money, the rich people were saying. Stop giving our money to people who need it. That was a separate and parallel track to the track that is laid down in Democracy Chained. She's talking about not a past movement of how conservatism developed into what it is today. She was saying that there's a stealth movement that we can't see because we either don't pay attention, it's not being reported in the press. And just as an aside, when I have to read all of these voter repression laws that are going around the country, the template for all of these laws, if you pick them up, whether you're looking at Mississippi or you're looking at Georgia or you're looking at Montana or Texas, the wording is the same because it comes from the American Legislative Exchange Council, which is a wholly owned subsidiary of Koch Enterprises. That these laws are being fanned into flame by the Koch brothers. And that is to make clear to everyone that if we get to, this republic gets to a point of everyone having the right to vote, their rights as the providers of income in taxes begin to be impeded. And so that's the war they're fighting. They believe that you get enough poor people and middle class people voting against them, pretty soon they'll be back to FDR times where my father, who earned $20,000 a year, was in the 90% tax bracket. And so rightfully, conservatives would fight against that, saying that's not fair. That is not fair. Well, they've taken the idea of fairness in conservatism and turned it into something completely different. And so left out of the book is, and purposely left out of the book, you didn't miss this, but she leaves out of the book the idea that Barry Goldwater was far more strict and conservative and racist than anything the Koch brothers could come up with. But Barry Goldwater's not mentioned. He doesn't need to be mentioned because that's on the other track of conservatism. She doesn't talk about the Southern strategy, where after the civil rights bills were passed under a Democratic president, Lyndon Johnson, the 64 Civil Rights Act, 65 Voting Rights Act were passed, that Democrats were voted out of office in the South. And Nixon saw a way to take all of those people who were racist and hated the idea that African Americans were given broader voting rights, that they decided at that point that Republicans had to shift from the Republicans that my mother and father were to, and I'll use the word, to racist, exclusionary people. William F. Buckley said in one of his very early books that conservatism can be described as, if you are a true conservative, you stand, I'm quoting, you stand to thwart history yelling stop. You are trying to stop progress. So that's why we get progressives on one side, and on the other side, you get people who are status quo oriented. They don't want to change. They do not want to know that there is a country coming at them where the demographics will show that whites will be in the minority at some point, where the money earners who are not middle class, but the very richest, will be set upon by taxes. They want that to stop. They want history to stop. And they want government to get out of their lives. And they want government to be so small that it provides very little. And then you have the Newt Gingrich move to get rid of a lot of the welfare that the government was for, to try to get entitlement programs down to where they were nothing. And so that was conservatives going back and saying, make government smaller. But Nancy connects the dots, and that's the part that I like. And what was not brought up because of time limitations in our conversation, that a close reading of her book draws this straight line from slave plantation ownership, moneyed people, straight through to Harry Byrd of North Carolina, who Virginia rather, who stood in. I mean, we think of George Wallace and Orville Faubus as standing in higher education and saying, no black people will ever come into this school, at state schools, because of segregation at that time. That before that, Harry Byrd locked up Prince George's County schools after the Board of Education, Brown versus Board of Education, said you have to desegregate. And that's where public choice came from. And so we hear public choice today used in, ways that seem almost benign. We're going to give more opportunity to this person because you have a choice, a voucher system, maybe to send your kids to a private school, white people primarily, to send to a private school, and they padlocked the doors of the educational institutions for 6 years so that no black child got any education, because they were standing athwart history and defying by what sometimes referred to as nullification or interposition, where state law was more important than the federal decision by the Supreme Court of the United States. So you have two ways of fighting Supreme Court mandates like that, which broaden the right to vote. You can make it a conservative majority who are nailed to the concept that is outlined in her book of public choice and small government, so that they would say yes to restrictive abortion or the undoing of Roe versus Wade. They would say yes to dropping Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, any kind of affordable health care that the government runs, because they want to privatize that. They want to put it in the hands of people who will make even more money. And we see that in our prisons right now, that about 40% of all the prisons in the United States are run by private corporations, not by states or federal governments. So she draws this perfect line. What was not mentioned in the conversation is the work that Dr. Buchanan did and the Montpearl Society did in trying to replicate Lenin's Bolshevik revolution, using the same techniques that Lenin used to fire up his crowd. And what he did was change all the institutions from the inside, while the rabble, while the protesters were out fighting what they thought was an inequality, the proletariat, what he was doing back here was changing all of the institutions inside. And we see that now with Vladimir Putin and the oligarchs. So what we're headed toward, if we don't unchain the democracy, is an oligarchy of the rich running the lives of everyone, replacing government, as it were, um, making government smaller, but making all of the powered decisions coming from people who are moneyed, and they're doing it by stealth, and they're doing it quietly. We concentrate on these big steps. What we need to be looking at, she says, is the small steps. Because it's the tortoise and hare analogy. Um, the hare will get all the attention from the press because he's running so fast, but it's the tortoise who wins the race, and that's what she is warning against. Is pay attention to the slow walker, the one who's making the little teeny changes that will amount to massive change within the next 2 decades if we don't do something to intervene and say, I see what you're doing. So it's like watching the magician and knowing the trick. She's warning us to learn the magic that they're performing. They're illusions. And on one side, they'll say something very positive. And David Koch is the underwriting sponsor for PBS's Nova. Ask how many Novas on PBS, the most liberal of all media, has been on climate change. They've skirted it one time, but they don't want to lose the funding from the David Koch Foundation. And the amount of money that Charles Koch is putting into these grassroots organizations, which I have to admit that I was fooled by in my career, in the early goings of my career. I was fooled by, because I would get calls from the different organizations, Americans for Prosperity, the Cato Institute, the Freedom Partnership. I would get 7 calls a day and they sounded like 7 different organizations. And I would put them on the air because I was unaware. I was not trained. I was not learned enough in those early goings. And what they were all doing was reading from the same playbook. And my audience was being misled that, boy, a lot of people are saying the same thing. That's not true. A lot of people are not saying the same thing. One person is saying something that a lot of the carriers of the message are getting into the media. And they're not representative because they don't represent the majority. If you look at Republicans and Democrats in Congress right now, and when I say Congress, I mean both the upper and lower house, the Senate and the House of Representatives, that they are representative of about, they have 50% of the vote, representing about 18% of the population. And it is a frightening time in American history, but we have to be vigilant. That's her call to arms, that we have to be informed and vigilant. And now I promised her that I would mention that the criticism she's gotten on the book, some things are about words, one sentence that was taken out of context, others that she has misread the history, and that's a funny charge to put on a historian, and a damaging charge. She could have, if they had continued, and they do to some degree continue now, whenever this book is brought up, she could be brought up on academic charges. She could lose her tenure. She could lose her position in academic academies that she is a part of, and lose her status as one of the great historians in America, but that's not going to happen, because a clear reading of this is that her intent was made very clear, and she did draw these perfect lines. And as an investigative reporter who has looked at the criminal allegations his whole life, that you must have three things present in order for a charge to stick. And one is means, one is motive, and one is opportunity. And in this case, the Koch brothers have, well, the one Koch brother, Charles Koch now, because David died, is they have the means, an immense amount, $1.6 billion spent in Congress. Try to divide that up. Do that in your head. So you got 525 members of Congress. Divide 1.6 billion among them. So I'm going to say something, even though this is being recorded. It's my personal opinion. I'll state this. I'm not stating it as a fact. It is my personal opinion that the Gilded Age is returned, that rich people are buying representatives of Congress, representatives and senators of Congress. They're purchasing them because of our election laws, and Citizens United allowed personhood to corporations. They can have this immense effect on public policy. And if anything is frightening to me, is that if you put in the hands of rich people to write laws on freedoms and the provision of government to help stabilize not an economy, but stabilize the life and welfare and happiness of individuals, they will deny that to you once they get control. And so I don't think it is disputable that through election donations, the super rich are buying Congress to do their bidding. It is not one person, one vote anymore, because the amount of money going into the coffers from big corporations and from moneyed people like Koch has an outsized influence on the way people think. Because, and I'll give you a personal story. I was asked by the DCCC to run for Congress against Eric Paulson in the 3rd District of Minnesota for House of Representatives. I got a call from, and I will not name the Congress member, but the representative called me and said, let me tell you something. You don't want to do this. 1 year you legislate, but remember, you'll come in as a freshman, so you won't have a voice. You won't have a voice for maybe 10 years before you have any influence, before you get any good committee assignments. But you have to get reelected. So every 2 years, 1 year you legislate or you hang around the office. The other year you spend 40 hours a week on the phone begging people for money so that you can get enough in your coffers to be reelected. So a member of the House of Representatives really only works for 1 year, and the other year they're raising money, which is a terrible, terrible thing. And if a person, I'll use a name, Newt Gingrich, when he was running for president on the Republican side, it was announced that his treasure chest was empty. Then an Arizona business person came in and gave him $6 million. That resurrected his campaign, and then he was able to do commercials for television, do whatever. Now I'm going to ask you this question: if he got elected as president of the United States, and I, as a voter, as a constituent, as an American citizen, called line 1 of the White House, and simultaneously the Arizona business person called line 2, and the candidate had only time to take the one phone call, which one would he take? And that is an illustration of what I think is happening. that the people with the money are being listened to, and the people with the money are the ones who are trying to avoid their fair share of taxes. And they're the ones who are trying to get government out of the business of helping others. And I think Nancy laid that out clearly. And her book should be read by everyone. But they also should read the criticisms, which I did before I began. Because as a reporter, I want to see what the people who love her are saying, but I want to see what the people who hate her are saying. And then I wash out all the accolades, and I just try to look at the facts. Did she say this, and is it supported by the facts? And the answer is, in 99% of the cases, that's true. And then you take the accolades out and you say, what points did she make that are important and enough value to repeat to you? And I think what she did was created through thread from the beginnings of the idea of this particular idea, and that's public choice economics, through the Virginia School of Economics and later George Mason University, that economists are being turned out now daily at every graduation ceremony. Economists are being turned out who say this is a lopsided economy and a lopsided democracy that pits the majority against the minority. We know that to be true in another sense. We know that to be racially true. But they position themselves as the minority in this case, and law actually supports that. So when it gets to especially if you read the law conservatively, especially if you're an acolyte of Acton and Scalia, you will see, yes, they are a minority. They must be protected, while turning their backs on the protection of those people who historically for 400 years have needed the protection. And so the public welfare is not a public welfare. It's actually a welfare for the very rich. And they have outsized power, the Koch brothers. And I'm not a scaredy cat, but her book makes me want to pay very, very, very close attention to the small steps, not the big steps, but the small steps. And digging into that detail is really incredibly difficult and above the level of thinking, intellectual inquiry of half of the United States. And that's the half that will end up suffering as a result of an oligarchical sort of republic, because it won't be a republic anymore. It will not be a confederation of states. It will be run by rich people. And that's the point she is trying to make. And in my opinion, she is accurate. So I'll end there and see if you have any questions for me that I can attempt to answer.
Thank you, Don. That was a very good summary of her book. Really appreciate it. I think Sylvia Schwartz had her hand up. Sylvia, are you there? Oh, and by the way, sorry to back up 1 second. When you're going to ask a question, please identify yourself with your name and your organization, so Don knows who he's talking to. And also, do all of you know how to raise your hand to ask a question? There is on the bottom of the screen, the icon that says reactions. If you hit that, it's on the bottom right hand of your screen. There's an option to raise your hand. I think it's a little different for an iPad. And if that doesn't work, just raise your hand. Sylvia, go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Mr. Shelby. That's your comments and insight is very informative. I wanted to ask, you were talking about ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, and talking about some of the laws that they have introduced. They've also introduced a lot of laws in state legislatures around the country. Oh, and I forgot to mention that I'm with the Jewish Voice for Peace, Twin Cities. So one of these laws that we have been working against, and other people on this call have also been working against, is a restriction on Minnesotans' First Amendment rights to boycott Israel. So a lot of these laws are introduced and they sound very benign, and even Democrats vote for them because they sound so benign. And that's what happened in Minnesota. This law passed and Governor Dayton signed it into law. I'm just wondering about what you think of the strategy of going against these benign sounding laws one at a time in state legislatures, or working with the U.S. Congress. You know, how do you fight against things that are so wide and broad and go up and down the both state legislatures and the U.S. Congress and the media and, you know, all other aspects of our lives? How do you fight against it?
I'm going to break it down into 3 ways, Sylvia, and that was a great question. One is a criticism of journalism, that they are not connecting the dots. They talk about voter repression laws a lot on CNN and on the major networks and elsewhere, except Fox. But what they failed to do is draw a direct line between that and ALEC. So the ALEC part is essential to being publicly informed. So one of the best techniques that I have ever found as a public journalist is being able to say to people, read it again, you're being manipulated. No one wants to be manipulated. But if you can make the case that it is a manipulation for a reason by a set of individuals or an individual who has created this so that you are intentionally being, because it sounds benign, you are intentionally being manipulated by being soothed into the idea that this is a good thing, when a closer reading of it is that it is a bad thing. So going to the media and informing them that this is what is happening and that this is all, it is not something that spontaneously developed in Minnesota, but something that has been developed nationally by a cabal of individuals who have a purpose for you voting that into being. The second is that just a real quick civics lesson, which you all know very well, but in a republic, the state legislatures are the crucibles for all ideas that percolate up to the federal level. It's high. Our government is hierarchical. And so if a law gets passed in Michigan and it seems to be working, then somebody, either through ALEC or somebody visits them, or somebody, they have these conventions where they all gather and they go, we got a law that does this. And you look at the laws that were passed in Wisconsin under Scott, what happened there as governor, where they decertified the Public Employees Union. Hey, that'd be a good idea to bring to Mississippi. Well, Mississippi's right to work state. That'd be a good idea to bring to another place, because then we have control over them and their welfare. And we can, and then the benign part is that, and we save you tax money because we won't have to pay as high a wage to these people and won't be held at gunpoint at the bargaining table to either pay the higher wage or close the schools, for instance, or close the public hospitals. And so you go, well, we don't want the schools to close. So yeah, just decertify the union. It sounds like it's proper, but what they're doing is they're taking these baby steps to completely decertify all unions and the protections that union workers have in America. So it's the first step. Let's start there. And it is puppetry. And those people controlling the strings of the marionette are only a few, but they're getting the entire country to change under the guise of some belief that this is a benign thing. This is a good thing. Well, let me tell you something from a person who has fought and faced jail time over First Amendment issues. There's a reason why the First Amendment is number one in the Bill of Rights. Because without that capacity to speak and discuss and express opinion, we might as well close up shop. If you don't have that, ability to speak, and I can just tell you that when I was sit down writing this in the wake of the passage of the Constitution and the demand that a Bill of Rights be included, because the Constitution, as you read it, outlines the power of government. And that's when they came to Madison and said, we need rights guaranteed to people. That's not in your Constitution. And so before it would get ratified, Madison had to include this Bill of Rights, which guaranteed these rights to human beings. So I recommend that you read at least 20 of the amendments to see what are our protections and who's trying to take away those protections. And you can identify them as being the super rich who have formed a cabal and are finding ways to tinker with the system that if it works, that we will have a future where the democracy that we understand, that the will of the majority is going to disappear. And I know I've repeated myself, but I want to make sure that I've answered Sylvia's question. One is getting to the media and explaining in clear terms, not rabid terms, but in almost academic terms. This is what this says. How does that sit with you who live under the protection of the First Amendment? And then once they see that they themselves will be affected, then you can gin up enough energy in the media. And what the media does, what the press does, is then inform the people that this is some magic trick that's being pulled by a very few people that will affect everyone. I know I didn't get very deep on that, Sylvia, and I apologize, but I'm conscious of the time.
Yeah, thanks, Don. I really loved your one way of approaching the media that certainly makes sense is to let them know they're being manipulated and they don't want to be manipulated on this stuff.
Yeah.
How do we deal? We are forming a committee, and we're going to be responding on Twitter to journalists. I've been doing that lately. If you respond right away to a journalist's tweet, you're more likely to be seen. Because there are a lot of articles right now about voter suppression, but 99% of the time, the journalist does not mention the Koch brothers and their decades-long plan of voter suppression laws. They're not connecting the dots, as you say. How do we deal in talking with journalists about this both sidism?
Well,
Yeah.
So,
go ahead.
So I'm very familiar with the problematic notion of balance and fairness. It comes of where we've really gotten into trouble as journalists is that we ourselves are not that informed because we have to be by nature generalists. There are very few specialists. When I got into the business, we all had beats. So we could all get to know the subject matter very deeply. But one day you're covering a train derailment, next day you're covering the state legislature, and the next day you're covering medicine, and the next day you're covering a lost child. And so you don't have the capacity to focus on these things. So one of the things that I would do is, because specialists do still exist. For instance, Eric Black for the Star Tribune, who now works for MinPost, is an example of a person so steeped in his area that he would see clearly, and has written, in fact, on this kind of subject. But what your job is to, in Twitter, and this is not a face-to-face meeting. They're two different animals, but in the face-to-face,
We'll do both. Yeah, we'll do both.
Okay, but in the Twitter sphere, Terry, I would start with, you should be ashamed of yourself. You have completely missed what is happening, and get tough, because no one wants to see a response to something you said on Twitter that points you out as being uninformed and unaware. And that will shock them, they'll be embarrassed, and they will learn, because your status as a reporter is affected. But more importantly, your sense of self is impacted. Someone, and it happened to me probably 100 times in my life, where somebody called me after a story I reported and saying, "You didn't say anything about this." And I went, "Oh my God." Well, that's because I didn't know it. No one told me that. Well, your job is to tell them that. My job in emails is to tell people that. I just email, I read a story, and then I say, for God's sakes, look at Alec. You've got to look at that. You got to see why this is happening. It is not just Republican, Democrat. It's because these laws are being created for mass consumption under the guise of protecting the integrity of an election system, which is not, there is absolutely no evidence that it lacks integrity. But they're being fed a bunch of lies, and the lies become believable when there is, they provide evidence of this. And part of the evidence is self-cycling. Part of the evidence is this: Americans are losing faith in their electoral system. They're losing faith in the democracy. Well, why is that? Because this story of fraud in the election, in the 2020 election, comes back to the public as there is something wrong. But they started the rumor, and now they lose faith. They didn't have any problem with faith in the electoral system until they started the story, and now they do, because the lie has been accepted and the repetition of the lie. Goebbels in Nazi Germany made it very clear that the way you get a message across is to have it repeated by trusted sources. The problem in our country is that we've got two sets of trusted sources. There are some people who will only listen, who only trust Sean Hannity or Tucker Carlson. And there are other people on the other side who only trust Rachel Maddow or Chris Cuomo or somebody on the network news. They only trust those. So those are the only messages that are landing. Because of our confirmation biases, we will not listen to anything that has a tendency to intrude upon our critical thinking, which we think is critical thinking, which is really just the repetition of opinion that we've adopted from someone else. We have not arrived at a conclusion. Let me give you a brief example of that. We could use the Derek Chauvin case. We could use any trial in America. There's a jury that sits. Evidence is presented, both sides, defense, prosecution. At the conclusion of the trial, the judge then says to the jury, here are the possible things that you can find based on the evidence you have heard. There were in Chauvin, there were 5. You can find any of these 5 that the evidence fits. Now retire to the deliberation room and return with your opinion. No, doesn't say that. He doesn't say return with your opinion, because you walked into the jury room with an opinion and then you heard evidence, and now your opinion goes out the window. Now you have to deal with the facts. And so he says, or she says, return with your verdict. Return with your conclusion after the examination of all of the evidence. If anything is missing today, if I fear anything more than I fear the developing oligarchical structure of America, I fear that Americans have lost the capacity to critically think. To have an opinion, that's fine, but be able to change your mind. To be able to say, oh, I just got some information here that I trust. And, the opinion I held was wrong. I'm going to alter my opinion. Use gay marriage as an example. 90% of Americans in 1950 thought that was an abhorrent abomination. 90%, an abhorrent abomination. And then the Supreme Court ruled, no, it's fine. It's fine, because we got new evidence. And we changed our minds. One of the most beautiful ads I ever saw on television, Dad had promised to take the kid to Disney World, but COVID or something got in the way. And he said, I know I promised you, son, to take you to Disney World, but I've changed my mind. And the child said, and this is, it's inculcated in me. The child looked at the daddy and said, that's okay, Daddy. That's what minds are for. Isn't that beautiful? Minds are for changing. They change throughout our lives as we get new information and we let go of the old things. A child may have been raised in a racist household. And as they go through life, they realize, well, that brown doesn't rub off their skin, or, they're not trying to steal my money or whatever my parents had told me. And they change their minds. They're not stuck. Too many Americans are just stuck. They don't want to go any further. And I want to be very clear. It works as much on the liberal side as it does on the conservative side. And I can give you an example on climate change. So when I give speeches, I say, how many people believe that the CO2 is causing changing of the climate and greenhouse gases? Everybody holds up their hands. I go, how do you know that? And I said, and do you hear what I said? I said, how many believe? Science is not a belief system, but half the room couldn't tell you a molecule from an atom. They only know they're part of a tribe. Then I asked people over here, how many people believe it's a hoax? Everybody. What's your evidence? They don't have anything. They just don't want it to be true. And they believe Rush Limbaugh, or they believe Pat Michaels, or they believe Richard Lindzen. They cling to these things like flotsam after a ship sinking. They cling to anything that will keep them afloat so they don't have to change their goddamn minds.
Yeah. Thanks, Don. Tom Nichols, do you know him, Death of Expertise?
Yes.
I happened to hear an interview with him where he talked exactly to that, how once we've chosen our team, it's almost impossible for people to admit they were wrong. You know,
Yes.
whether it is on the left or the right, it really is a problem
Yes.
to admit that we were wrong. And especially when those beliefs have been the beliefs we've held or knowledge we've held for a couple of years. But my
Terry,
last question.
let me say this,
Sure.
and then you can continue.
Sure.
In my old age, and it probably started when I was in my 50s, I reveled. I was joyful to say I was wrong. I reveled in that because it made me feel like I was growing, that I was becoming smarter. To be able, it shouldn't be any shame attached to having been wrong. The only shame is continuing to be wrong and knowing that you are wrong.
Except when you're in a team, when you're in a tribe. With my Trump relatives, they are not going to defy their tribe, their team. That's what makes it really hard. When we identify, when our identification is with this set of beliefs.
And because you're being validated by them, but that's no
But to
different than
repudiate them,
right.
Repudiate them and say,
Right,
you
because
guys are
then you're
all
going to
wrong.
lose friends. You're going to lose friends.
Right.
Yeah.
That's what's, yeah.
Well, are they really friends?
Yeah.
Are they really people you want to associate with? I mean, do you really want, and having an argument with Uncle Fester is almost impossible because they're not going to change their minds. And I've given up trying to change people's minds. All I try to do is just present facts. And my mantra, what I taught in college, what I taught all of my mentees through 55 years of journalism was your job is, you have only one job. And you keep this in the back of your mind. Know this and proceed. Know this and proceed. And once you give them that, instead of know this and proceed this way, know this and proceed this way. As soon as you've committed that error, and that's what cable news is doing on both sides of the spectrum, tell you what you should be doing, what you should. As a journalist, I can tell you, I have absolutely no concern about which way they proceed, as long as they know this. So let's just use climate change as an example. Know these facts, that climate change is real. Now proceed. Now that you know this, proceed. You can do a free market solution, and you can do a government mandated solution. It is not my business as a journalist to tell them how to proceed, because that's the democracy. Proceed in your way once you are at a point where you agree that, yeah, the planet's warming and it's caused by greenhouse gases. I got a solution. Let's build a big machine that sucks CO2 out of the air. Let's put up some geoengineering and put some aluminum chips and sulfates in the air, and that will cool the planet. And another person says, let's get the federal government to pass a law through Congress and signed by the president that says we're going to reach this goal by this time, and anyone who violates it pays a penalty. We're going to put a cap and trade issue into effect, or a fee dividend into effect, and we're going to work toward this government mandated thing. I don't care how you do it. Just solve it. Now that you know that it's true, solve it.
Thank you, Don. Our last question, Stan Sattinger. You're muted.
Thank you. Yes, I'm Stan Sattinger. I'm with Minnesota 350.
Hey, Stan.
And I would ask of the actions that you're urging on us as watchdogs, what portion of those actions would be appropriate as individuals, and what portion would be appropriate as groups?
I can't tell you how large my trash can was at my desk at WCCO TV or radio when I would get a news release from an organization. That doesn't work very well. Organizations don't work very well. News releases from organizations don't work very well. What works is a guy calls me on the phone, woman calls me on the phone and says, Don, I think you're wrong about that. And let me help you out. I can give you some facts that maybe you want to include in your next report. And because that's who I am, I want to know what. I'm eager to listen to someone who says the report wasn't complete. Personal relationships, developed personal relationships with reporters, later on with editors, and then managing editors and specialists, and just conversations. Let me guide you in this direction. I'm not guiding you for a political reason. I'm just saying, let me guide you to this information which was missing from your story. And you verify it. I'm not going to tell you. You verify that information. I'm not saying that press releases from organizations don't work. The power of an organization and its membership works. And it works in an interesting way. And I'm going to tell you the soft underbelly of commercial newspapers and television and radio. If you represent enough people and saying, because of that report, our membership is going to stop buying every product that you advertise and stop watching your channel. Stop buying your newspaper. And then send that press release and say, we will encourage everyone until you begin to tell the truth, until you get better reporters who can find the facts. Because here are the facts, and these were what were left. This is what was left out, and it was slanted, and it's not journalism. And that's the reason for our action. So the power of the group and your affiliated groups has immense power, because I guarantee you that letter arrives on the general manager's desk. They're in the newsroom on fleet foot, and they're at the news director and saying, this cannot stand. I cannot lose subscribers. I cannot lose because you goofed up. Do better. And they will. So that's where the power of an organization comes from, not in press releases like that, but in direct communication with the people who are put in place to protect their money and to protect their reputations. Those are so it's not a broad press release. We're going to boycott Channel 4. But a letter to the news director or to the general manager, I would say the general manager, saying this is under consideration because we're so disappointed with how weak this coverage is and how lacking in evidence-based material it is. It gets attention like you cannot believe.
I suppose the fair thing to do is to start with the journalist and, try to make your point with.
Yeah, absolutely. Because journalists are by no means perfect people. They may even have a bias themselves, which we try to root out almost strategically. So we know that you send two people to a convention, two reporters to a convention, and they come back and they write completely different stories. But that's human. That's just human. My eyes see I went to a different school. I'm a different race. I'm a different sex. My eyes are going to see things differently, and it's going to be filtered through my bias. But then in journalism, we rely on a three-legged stool. Missing one of those legs, it tips over. fairness, accuracy, and balance. Fairness, accuracy, and balance. Now, balance has gotten a mistaken notion in many circles of journalism. But let me give you an example of what balance would be. And I've argued this with newspapers. 25 years ago, when it was a debate on climate change, let's say you had a 20 column inch story. 10 column inches would be it's happening and it's scientifically valid, that we can prove it. And the other half would be people saying, no, it'd be too expensive to fix and it's probably isn't happening and it's a natural occurring event. Even though in 2019, that Dr. Ben Satter and Lawrence Livermore came up with a 5 sigma, that the chances of climate change occurring, anything other than human caused by chance, was 1 in 3.5 million. 5 standard deviations from the mean. That's proof enough. I mean, that means that if you're going to flip a coin, you would flip it 3.5 million times minus 1, and they would all be heads. And that last one would be a tails. See, it just can't happen by chance. So arguing those certain kinds of facts can be convincing to people to change their mind. But so we have this balance thing. So let's presume that 97%, if you believe Naomi Oreskes and Kevin Conway in Merchants of Doubt, that the research, the massive research that Naomi did on all of the published peer-reviewed material shows that 97% of all atmospheric and climate scientists agree that CO2 and greenhouse gases are causing the warming of the atmosphere on planet Earth. 97. That leaves 3. But a further examination of that is 2 of them say, yes, it's happening, but the climate sensitivity of the Earth atmosphere is not so bad that it's going to be alarming, that terrible things are going to happen. Those are 2. One says, nah, it's fine. There's nothing wrong with it. Everything's perfect. It's all natural cause and what have you. So here's what balance looks like then. On a, let's say 100 column inch story on a double truck feature of a newspaper, 97 inches would be devoted to the science, and 2 to the people who are in the middle, and 1 to the person who said that it's not happening. That would be literal balance, the balance of evidence. The same thing is looked at in civil law when they talk about preponderance of evidence. So when you amass preponderance of evidence in a court of law, if this were ever argued before a jury in a civil case, and it will be because ExxonMobil is being sued, all of these come, Chevron, all of these companies are being sued, Coke is being sued, it will go to a court of law, and the jury will simply ask, say, where is the bulk of the evidence? So you don't have to do clear and convincing evidence. You don't have to do beyond a reasonable doubt. We can operate as individuals on the idea that the preponderance of evidence demonstrates that this is happening and therefore action is required. You get my point?
Thank you for that.
Okay.
Yeah, I like that definition of balance. Not the 50-50 definition of balance
No.
that we get all the time.
Yeah, and that's because journalists are not scientists. I hate to admit this in this forum, but I will. Journalists are artists. Their right side is working. They didn't do very well in physics and algebra. And so they went to school in an arts program which contained journalism, and they never had to touch advanced calculus. They never had to touch advanced chemistry and never had to touch advanced physics. Purposely, because that was an easier path for them. That's where their brain was working. Now they come around and they get credentialed as journalists, and their first assignment is to go study the molecular effect of greenhouse gases. Well, they're lost. They're absolutely lost. So the only thing they can do, and I've done it early in my career, you go to a trusted chemist or a trusted physicist and you say, I don't know the answer. What is the answer? And then they give you their statement. And you go to somebody else on the other side and say, what is the answer? And they give you the same, because you don't know crap. You don't know anything. You don't know what the truth is. And that's why, as I said at the beginning, I became an investigative reporter, because my objective was to know the truth. My objective was not to say, here are two sides of an issue and you guys decide who are watching. My job was to say, here's the truth. Here's the verdict. Here's the conclusion. And you can act upon that based on the evidence I presented. So, so that's the answer, Terry, that for the longest time, and there are still people at New York Times, Washington Post who are science-based. I mean, they are beat people, and they get all of that stuff. But you can't be an environmental reporter because you love camping. That is not going to be, that's not going to tell you what the 10 soil horizons are in regenerative agriculture. You're going to have to go to someone and say it works, and then go to someone and says it doesn't work. And it's not going to sequester enough carbon to offset the problems. And so, and it ends up then in the lap of the public, and the public goes, I have no earthly idea what they're talking about.
Yeah.
Or why they're even telling me this. Like I should know, because they also didn't take physics and they also didn't take chemistry.
Well, Don, this has really been great, especially since we are starting a media committee, and we will be in touch with you for advice and feedback
Okay.
on this. But thank you so much for your time for both of these events, and for preparing for our previous event and structuring it and giving us some order in the Nancy MacLean event. Really appreciate it. So we'll be back in touch with you, and all our appreciation. Thank you.
Thank you so much.